Okay, without further ado, let us welcome our speaker, Dr. Duke Pesta.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. I got to tell you, I just love Texas. All the politicians that come and they stand up and they greet people in Wisconsin, when we have Republican meetings like this or conservative meetings, they don't even bother to come. So it's absolutely staggering that you're all here, although you do know now, right? We're going to be watching to see who leaves early. So you're watching that. But God bless y'all. Hey, California is going to let illegal immigrants vote in elections. Can I be an illegal American, an illegal Texan, and come and vote for you guys? Would that be okay? Why don't we just play that game, right? Let's have Republicans crossing state lines to vote for other Republicans. I mean, why not? And she tipped the hat there for a little bit. I mean, I'm born in Ohio. I live now in Wisconsin. I'm kind of a Yankee. I'm probably not the kind of guy you would trust, but I did marry a Texan. And for 20 years, she's told me that I, as a husband, very often am all hat and no cattle. Now, no. Don't tell me what that means. I've convinced myself that it's a compliment. But, she gets very mad at me because I brought her up to Wisconsin where she's freezing to death, and I keep coming down here. And so, yeah. But in any event, I'm really grateful to be with you today. We've got a lot of serious stuff to talk about, and it's, before you're done, it's going to be almost a shocking experience. There are brighter sides and there are solutions to this, but we are in a very grave place now when it comes to education, and you know that or you probably wouldn't be here. But let me start by sharing with you a couple of things. To understand where we are in American education today, you need to know two things, and I'll explain them for the remainder of the talk. One, the American government schools, I can't call them public schools anymore. If the American public schools were public schools, you'd have a say in them, wouldn't you? You wouldn't just pay for them with your property taxes. You would have a say. Things you don't like about your public schools in your area where the teachers underperform or where the kids are failing, you'd be able to clean them out, but you can't. You're paying for something. This is taxation without representation. That's seriously what this is. And so you don't have any control over them. The American government school system, I'm going to call them government schools, the American government school system now has actively, consciously, and willfully demoted to a very low place, a very low priority, skills. What your kids need to succeed in life. The ability to do math at a high level. You just heard her experience, right? With her kids. The ability to do math at a high level. The ability to read at a high level, to pursue STEM careers. We are lowering the overall educational assessments. We are lowering the standards. We are lowering the achievement for a variety of reasons. And what's taken the place of academic achievement, at the first thing we do is social justice education. You know what social justice education is. In the seminaries of 1960s, it used to be called liberation theology. Now it's called democratic socialism by our politicians. All it is warmed over socialist Marxist thought being applied to your kids. It's more important that we turn your kids into willing, complacent, compliant wards of the big federal government than it is to make them liberty-minded individuals who can become entrepreneurs and take care of themselves and their families. 60 million American school kids who can get jobs in high-paying careers, who can succeed in college, who can create families and create businesses and take care of them, they don't go to the government for handout. They don't seek higher taxes. They don't vote for big government programs. They don't wish open borders on our country. That's why that has to be done. Social justice education, using your kids for all sorts of sociological ends without consulting you. Introducing things like transgenderism into elementary schools. Reducing science class to long lectures on global warming. Turning your kids into advocates for left-wing positions. That's what they're doing now. I'm going to prove that to you. That's the first thing we got to know. That your kids are not primarily being educated in the government schools. Oh, I'm not saying they're going to graduate illiterate. I'm saying they're going to graduate 2 or 3 grades behind where they should be. My primary job is I'm a professor of English at the University of Wisconsin, which gives Austin a run for its money, Madison, Wisconsin. It really does. Because Madison, Wisconsin's surrounded by liberals. Austin ain't, right? That's the thing. But my university kids at the University of Wisconsin read at about a 9th grade level, seriously. My incoming freshmen at the University of Wisconsin, a well-regarded academic system, read about like freshmen in high school. That's it. I have a friend who teaches at Florida State University. He's got 2 degrees, 2 PhDs in math, and he works part-time for NASA. And this year, he was asked to teach 2 sections of 7th grade math for the incoming freshmen. 7th grade math. Because that's where our kids are. The NAEP scores, you know what the NAEP scores are? Those are the national statistics that measure our kids' performance in the classroom. I'll give you one statistics from the NAEP. Completely non-political group. Conservatives and liberals respect very much their assessment of education. 8th graders. In this country today, only 37% of 8th graders can read at an 8th grade level. Most are 2 years behind. Only 35% of 8th graders can do math at an 8th grade level. And in your inner cities, places like Dallas, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 18%, only 18% of 8th graders do math and read within 2 grade levels of where they're supposed to be. At the school I teach at, Freedom Project Academy, our online academy, we give placement tests to moms who want to put their kids in our school. The kids are 85% of the thousands of applications we get are 2 to 3 grades behind where they ought to be in terms of reading, writing, math, and science. This is not an accident. And when you hear people talk about what schools need, it's always money, facilities, money, right? We got to pay teachers better. When was the last time you heard, actually, I heard somebody talking about this, maybe it was you. When was the last time you heard somebody say, give us another 5% on the tax bond, and we're going to improve your kids' SAT scores by 50%. You never hear that stuff. That's a really important thing to keep in mind. Seems almost overkill, but let me show you. Remember this guy? John Gruber. There are a lot of parallels between the hijacking of healthcare and the hijacking of education, right? We know that when the federal government appropriates to itself things that it shouldn't have constitutionally and things that they can't really cover, everything gets more expensive and rarer, right? It doesn't improve. In fact, I'm fond of telling audiences, if you can tell me one thing in the last 100 years that the federal government took over and when they failed, gave it back to the people, I'll walk back to Wisconsin. Never had to walk anywhere. You can see I've never had to walk anywhere, right? It's pretty obvious. Brats and beer, that's all we eat in Wisconsin. And so that's the issue here, right? The problems that we have. Obamacare, you remember Nancy Pelosi, right? Got to pass it to know what's in it. 27,000-page bill, nobody read it. But at least Obamacare had a hearing before the Senate and the House, right? Supreme Court decided about certain aspects of it. C-SPAN did some specials on it. That was never done with education. You remember what he said about the passage of Common Core, right? Or Obamacare.
Healthy people are going to pay in. He made explicit that healthy people pay in and sick people get money. It would not have passed. Okay? Just like the people, lack of transparency is a huge political advantage. And basically, call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever. But basically, that was really, really critical to getting the thing to pass.
Call it the stupidity of the American voter, but if we told you what we were doing in Washington, you wouldn't vote for it. Duh. Right? This is the problem. So the second thing I want to tell you about education, what they're doing to your kids' education at the federal level, now that they federalized it, is exactly this kind of boondoggle. They don't tell you, you don't participate. What she said is exactly right. Your kid's entire education in the government schools has been reduced to a series of standardized tests that the teachers didn't write. No teachers wrote them. Your teachers don't get to see the tests. These big tests, national tests that they take every year, your teachers never see the How can your teachers benefit from these tests? They don't get to see the test questions. And you as moms and dads, you are not allowed to see the national tests your kids take. What possible benefit can this have for classroom teaching? Nothing. It has no, and if you're going to give the same test to 60 million American school kids, by definition, that test cannot tell a working teacher anything. There's no teacher in this country with 30 kids sitting in front of her who can benefit from any aspect of this testing. And so that tells you a very important thing. The tests themselves have nothing to do with your kids' education. They are huge aggregate data collecting mechanisms for federal government agencies. And say what you will about Obamacare, but like I said, it had a hearing before the House and the Senate, the Supreme Court. When they took over your kids' education, none of that happened. No one was consulted, not the teachers, not the teachers' unions, not the moms and dads, not the states. It was assembled and put in place before you even knew what it was. Common Core, your schools too, Texas. You know this. Your legislature banned Common Core, fantastic. But guess what? Talking about being hoisted on your own petard. Why can't the legislature get rid of Common Core, even though they banned it? Because you have district control over education, and that's a good thing. Districts should be allowed to control their choices, but who runs most of the district schools? Progressives, right? So they brought all the Common Core in, and they could, nothing to stop them. And that's the other thing. When Common Core came to your state, a lot of help for it. We're going to see that in a minute. But I want you to keep that clear, that all of this happened, because this is a real threat to the Republic. All of this happened without any vote, any consultation, any hearings, any accountability to Congress or Senate or to state legislatures. It was just done. Before you even see and hear how bad it is, understand how they did it. This is the kind of stuff that goes on in banana republics. Unelected, unaccountable people whose names you never heard of, in the space of 2 years, completely transformed American public schools without any input from you. And so, to make sense of what seem to be some shockingly bold claims, you've got to go all the way back to the founding of American public schools. Why did the founding fathers make no provision whatsoever for American government schools? They knew that if you put the government, particularly a federal entity, in charge of educating our kids, inevitably it would happen that they would educate those kids for their benefit, not for yours. They would use, because all statist education plans do this, right? Socialist education, the fascist education, Nazi education, communist education, it all does the same thing. It uses mandated state education. It kills off homeschooling, it kills off private schools, and what does it do? Only the state schools survive. And then the state schools are used not to give kids a high-level education, but to make them ideologically compliant. Do you understand when Horace Mann, the founder of American public schools in 1850, a good 80 years after the founding of this country, when Horace Mann decided he was going to put a government school system in, a public school system in, do you know who he found as a model? He looked all around the world, Horace Mann, and he alighted on the Prussian education methods. Prussia, of course, was Germany. It was a big chunk of Germany that ultimately Otto von Bismarck, what we would call today, very totalitarian state. They took kids away from their families at very young ages, boarded them publicly, gave them a statist education. That's the model the American public school system took. And there's a statue to Horace. We're knocking statues down all over the place. Why is nobody knocking down Horace Mann statues? You got a statue of Vladimir Lenin standing in Seattle. Nobody's knocked that down, right? This is a remarkable thing. The entire premise of American education when it was put into place was not to educate your kids. This is an actual quote from Horace Mann, who is called the father of American public schools. 1850, Horace Mann says, "After a child has arrived at the legal age for attending school, whether the child of noble or of peasant, the only two absolute grounds of exception from attendance are sickness and death. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause." 1850. We are constructing a public school system to make your kids, whether they're rich and privileged kids or they're poor kids, hostages to our objectives. The second most important, and by the way, when we're done, you come up and get a business card from me. I'll send you every one of these slides free of charge. You can have them. Fact check me. I got about 24 quotes like that from Horace Mann. Second most important figure in the history of early American education was John Dewey. Philosopher, right? You know that name. John Dewey, by the way, was not a pretend communist. He actually had the card. In 1917, John Dewey was in the Soviet Union after the Bolsheviks took up and spoke with Lenin directly, Vladimir Lenin, about how the Soviets educated their kids. He dedicated his long life, John Dewey, to socialist indoctrination in American government schools. Here's just one quote. Get the slides from me. I got dozens more from this guy. Dewey said in 1920, Dewey said this about the public schools: children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society that is coming, where everyone will be interdependent. That sounds a lot like Common, doesn't it? In 1920, John Dewey said, "We don't want critical thinkers in the schools. We are not educating your kids to think critically. We're educating them to conform." And that makes sense. When we get to the point of Common Core, I think very seldom does the American federal government, when it takes over something, give it an accurate name. Did any of you actually believe the Affordable Care Act was going to be affordable? They didn't believe it either. But they told you that's what it was. Common Core, they made a mistake. That's why all the states, including Texas, have rebranded it. And all these states run by Republicans, too. Mike Pence, our vice president, was the first one to do it. Indianans were furious about Common Core, didn't want it. So what did Mike Pence do? He listened to his constituents, and then he declared Common Core dead in Indiana, handed the education bill right back to his progressive Secretary of Education. They kept 98% of the Common Core standards and labeled them the Indiana state standards. Republican Governor Christ in Florida, another red state more or less, did the same thing. He just rebranded the standards the Sunshine State Standards. Right? That's a nice name. How can you be against sunshine? So that's the problem that we face here. But Common Core is the thing itself. Raise your hands, please, if your kids are common. 700 talks, not one, 700 talks, 48 states. No. Raise your hands if your kids are standard. But that's what Common Core is. What do I mean when I say social justice education? I mean this, that unless education, the American school system, creates kids who know exactly the same things, no kids are privileged enough to know more. No kids are allowed to know less. Unless every kid gets the same education, there is social injustice. And that includes personality traits. Some kids are better at math than others. That's not fair. So what the federal government has decided, progressives have decided, is we've spent 50, 60 years trying to help the lowest achievers in our society educationally. And guess what? You can't move them very much. Remember the Great Society in the 1960s? $20 trillion from the haves to the have-nots, and we have just as much poverty as we ever did. Right? Same thing with education. There are just going to be kids who don't like school, who aren't talented at school, who don't try at school. But it dawned on them, the progressives, that rather than trying to help the low-performing kids, wouldn't it just be a lot easier to hold down the high-performing kids? See, what you're laboring under, and this is not new with Common Core, under the George Bush, you had No Child Left Behind. Under Bill Clinton, you had Goals 2000. These were baby steps toward what Common Core was going to become. So, and really, the reality of this is that Common Core is not a Republican or a Democrat problem. It's a Washington Beltway versus the rest of the country problem. Because Republicans have been as bad on this as Democrats have been. George Bush gets rightly raked over the coals for No Child Left Behind, but he didn't write that, right? George Bush was supposed to be this radical right-winger. Who did George Bush allow to write the No Child Left Behind legislation? Ted Kennedy, right? When people say in Washington, D.C., you don't have two parties, that's why. George Bush, decent man, but no arch right-winger, when you elect the most liberal member of the U.S. Senate write the entire education bill. So we get to Common Core, and that's the point of it. You don't think your kids are common, but the federal government does. You don't think your kids are standardizable, but the federal government does. And if you're going to get 60 million American school kids to exactly the same place educationally, you know, right, that has to be a lower place. If all you're concerned about is outcomes, every time you raise standards, what happens? More kids tumble off. But you lower them low enough, like maybe 2 or 3 grades behind where they should be, and every kid can meet that standard. Welcome to Common Core. It's not an educational paradigm. It has nothing to do with education, as you will see shortly. So, John Dewey, we don't want kids who can think for themselves. We don't want entrepreneurs. We don't want liberty-minded kids. We want kids who are dependent. Kids who need help to add, subtract, buy groceries, figure out their mortgages. Horace Mann. Our purpose in creating an American public school system is to divorce kids from their families, their local communities, and their religious traditions. How about John Rockefeller? By the way, where did Dewey get all his money? Who funded him? John D. Rockefeller. When he wasn't busy quietly supporting the Nazi regime, he was funding the communist John Dewey. And here's what John D. Rockefeller in the 1930s, 32, said about the public schools. In our dreams, people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions, which were intellectual and character education, will fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we will work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. You're using the word folk in the 1930s. You do see the connection to Hitler, right? The Volca. We're not going to educate your kids for intelligence or for character. Those things will fade from their minds. And unhampered by tradition, we will work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. No. The task we set before ourselves is very simple. We will organize children, and we will teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. We are going to use the power of the school to collectivize kids, to regularize kids. 1932, excuse me. How about the NEA? How about the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the country? Really, let's call it what it is. The NEA is the most radically political organization in terms of how it spends its money, a big union, in the country today. They spend more of their teachers' union dues on political lobbying than any big, including the car makers' unions. Here's what the NEA said about the public schools right after World War II. American soldiers go off, fight and die in the name of democracy, blah, blah, blah. But while they were doing that, they come home to the GI Bill, they start sending their kids to college. Here's what the NEA said education was going to have to become. 1947, quote, far too many people in America, both in and out of education, look upon the elementary school as a place to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Do you really believe that? Far too many of you, 1947, actually believe that the elementary school is a place for reading, writing, and arithmetic. You remember Bill Ayers, the unrepentant terrorist bomber of the Pentagon, who got off, didn't get punished? Well, the only career really open to him after he was shamed was a professor of elementary education. For 30 years, Bill Ayers was a professor of elementary education in Chicago, teaching thousands and thousands of young teachers that the place, quote from him, the place for communism in the modern American school is the elementary grades. Far too many people think that education is primarily a place to learn reading and writing and arithmetic. 1948, what are we going to really do? Education for international understanding. Collectivism, where everyone is independent, Dewey said. What are they pushing for? Globalism. What are they pushing for? One world education. You know, Bill Gates, who spent about $7-8 billion helping Texas schools get Common Core textbooks, right? You know, the state of Texas didn't pay for Common Core textbooks. So Bill Gates came into the state and handed out hundreds of millions of dollars in grant money so your schools could go ahead and buy his textbooks. Now here's a question for you. What exactly are Bill Gates' education credentials? What are they? Can you imagine if it was the evil Koch brothers who spent $800 million buying textbooks for Texas school kids? Would that not be on the front page of every Texas newspaper? Rogue billionaires purchase American schools, right? Do you hear any of those? Because he's a left-wing ideologue like Rockefeller. Well, here's a word about it, right? When unqualified left-wing billionaires mess with our schools, buy them basically, that seems to be okay. Here's what they said in 1948. The purpose is international understanding, right? International education. How about and we know what happened in America's colleges between 1948 and 1969, don't we? What happened between 48 and 69? Radical, socialist revolutionaries on college campus. Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western culture's gotta go. Ironic, isn't it? The very same thing that Antifa is chanting today when they're throwing rocks through cop cars. The exact same worn-out, cliche Marxist chanting. Here's what they said, the NEA in 1948. Schools will become clinics whose purpose is to provide individualized psychosocial treatment to the student And teachers must become psychosocial therapists. If you know anything at all about Common Core, one of the most alarming aspects of it is how many burdens your teachers have to socially and psychologically evaluate the kids. Writing huge technology programs called PBIS, for instance, where teachers spend time every day entering observations. Your kids, they introduce shocking topics, right? In sixth graders are hearing about transgenderism, and the teachers have to watch and find out what the reactions are. If the kids say anything in class that might come across as overly religious or skeptical, perhaps, of what's being taught, these things become part of the record, too. In 1969, the objective the NEA set was to turn schools into clinics and teachers into psychosocial therapists whose job it is, effectively, to do the job of parents, to socialize them, to teach them about sexual values, to lecture them about political ideas. You remember when Barack Obama became president, all those videos that went around of little kindergarten kids singing songs, right? Now what do we have? Middle and elementary schools, kids, shunning Republican candidates. Remember when Paul Ryan showed up at a school and all the kids, 8-year-olds all marched out? 8-year-olds don't know what's going on. They were told to march out. It's kind of manipulation. 1969. We're nowhere near Common Core yet. I'll tell you what the absolutely cohesive moment was when all of these fantasies really had a shot. When we created in 1979 the utterly unnecessary Federal Department of Education. By that time, you had been educating kids in this country for 130 years. And so we create, out of whole cloth, a huge federal bureaucracy. There are 5,000 or so employees in the Department of Education. Only a handful of them actually have education degrees. Most of them have no education experience whatsoever. And when you allowed the federal government that kind of control, because remember it used to happen. Before the Federal Department of Education, Congress, whose job it is, voted money for various things like education. And then once Congress apportioned it, the money went directly to the states for educational purposes. Well, along comes the Department of Education. All that congressional money now goes first through the Department of Education, and they decide how we're going to parcel it. And so what ends up happening? From 1979 on, they started bribing and blackmailing states. Common Core was basically a blackmail, wasn't it? You're smart, Texas. Your state is one of only 4 states that didn't take the federal bribe, race to the top, to accept Common Core. Still got it anyway. That's got to hurt. You didn't even get the money, and you got the Common Core, right? That's what principle is going to do to you, right? At least when you're in Washington, D.C., that's what happens to you. Nevertheless, you got it, but it was a bribe. 46 states in the Union got, one example, 2009, New York was the very first state in the Union to apply for a race to the top federal grant. $700 million went from the public treasury to the state of New York schools. And the only stipulation for that money was any state that took any race to the top money was obligated to accept the Common Core standards when they were finally written. 46 states, including Wisconsin, took the Common Core standards for hundreds of millions of dollars before they were even written, before anybody even knew what they were. So New York in 2009 takes $700 million. 3 years later, Common Core is rolled out, and now New York is legally obligated to take those standards. And that's the power of the Federal Department of Education. And right now, I don't know if you're aware of this, as of 2015, under the ESSA Act passed by Republicans, the Every Student Succeed Act, remember in 2015, Republicans controlled the House and the Senate, right? Paul Ryan, Wisconsin, gave his Republican caucus one day to read an 1,100-page bill, 4 days before Christmas on a Friday when no one was paying any attention, and it was passed unilaterally between the House and the Senate. You know what the ESSA Act does? Every illegal thing, unconstitutional thing, that the federal government did under Barack Obama to get federal control of education, the Republicans in 2015 retroactively made legal so nothing could happen to it and enshrined it in stone. That's where we are today. But we're back in 1969. By 1983, John Dewey's principal successor, one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto, also a card-carrying Marxist, said this about America's schools, quote, "I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith. The classroom must and will become an area of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all of its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world in which the never realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved." By the way, is that why you send your kids to public schools? You think? Now again, I could do 4 hours just on stuff like this between 1850 and 1980. Gets a little bit better. Now we jump to the present. That's Arne Duncan. That is Barack Obama's Secretary of Education for 7 of his 8 years as president. And notice the date. This is March of 2009. This is 3 short months after Obama took office. And the plan. Did you know this too? Remember in 2008 when the outgoing George Bush and the incoming Barack Obama both told you that unless you forked over billions and billions of dollars in stimulus money, banks and car companies would go broke? Did you know that about $4 billion of the stimulus package was handed right back to the Federal Department of Education to create Common Core? Did you know that? You're going to see that in just a moment. Didn't tell you that, did they? Here's Arne Duncan, 3 months into the Obama administration, and listen to what he says his plan for education is.
I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthy.
So 8 to 8 or something like that.
At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 2 dozen of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. And this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we again have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. Let me be clear, this is thinking differently, being creative.
We need our schools open 13, 14, 15, and 365 days a year. And listen to what he said. The government schools need to become the centers of every community, not the local sheriff's department, not the local administration, not the local family home or the churches. No. Schools have to become the centers of the community. Did you hear him when he said, 1969, schools will become clinics? We are building clinics on our new school construction. That's what they're doing on new schools. Chicago's got a bunch of these schools. Brand new schools built with clinics. And why would you say are they putting clinics on public schools? I'll give you one reason. Under the Obamacare mandate, which ties into education, the American public school system can provide birth control, including the morning after abortion pill, to your public school girls as young as 12 and 13 years old. And they do not have to contact you. They are not obligated to public schools. But here's the problem, right? Before you can prescribe birth control to a young girl, she has to have a rudimentary exam. And it's awfully unseemly when you're taking 12-year-old girls off campus. I'll give you a story from the Woodlands, down in the Woodlands. My sister-in-law lives in the Woodlands, and a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, she was 12. And she was getting ready to go to school one fall, and about a month before school started in the summer, all the girls in her age group got a letter from the school saying that it was mandated that 12-year-old girls had to have a gynecological exam before they could return to class in the fall. I got the letter at home. And she called me. She's a single mom, and she's busy, and she's also sick. She called me after the fact. I wish she would have called me sooner. But her first impulse, the first impulse of how many American families, when the public school says something, oh, we'll do it then, right? So she took the daughter in, got her a gynecological exam, and all those girls turned all their paperwork into the school to demonstrate they had it. You know what they were doing, right? You're saving the schools from having to have an examination for the kids. Now that they have on record that your daughters had been examined, they can give the birth control, which they started doing promptly that fall without consulting parents. And so you heard what Arne Duncan said, right? And you think about this, if there's you may not even begin to believe, this all sounds too fabulous. Maybe by the end when I put all the connections together, you'll see it. But if you're starting to see a pattern here, then you see a pattern. You've got schools everywhere. I was just talking on the way down here, I was talking to some folks. How many new schools are they building? Where are you guys that drove me down? How many new schools are they building in your area alone?
72.
70 new schools, and what's your area?
Frisco.
72 new schools in Frisco. You used to be a church on every corner in America. It's a school now. And if maybe you're still not convinced, but if this is ultimately about centralizing and controlling from the top, that's a wonderful array of networks to have at the very center of every community. Did you hear him make a Freudian slip? He said, parents want our stores open longer. Right now, in places like, you know, right? In places like Green Bay, Wisconsin, Memphis, Tennessee, we're feeding kids 3 meals a day in the public schools. It's not hot lunches anymore. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Places like Green Bay and Memphis, they've won federal grant money to keep the schools open for 3 months in summer to feed kids breakfast, lunch, and dinner when the school's out. Because here's the federal government's understanding. If we're going to feed your kids for 9 months, 3 meals a day, you're too stupid to feed your kids during the summer. So now we're opening the schools up in the summer and feeding them then. So we're giving them medical care. We're giving them birth control. We're feeding them their meals day in and day out. Who's the parent here? And if we consent, and here's the other thing. So what do I mean when I said social justice education? You would think that a healthy republic would help the helpless. Feed those who legitimately can't feed themselves. But see, that's a social stigma. If in the public schools, you're only feeding the low-income kids, you're stigmatizing them. It looks bad. So you gotta feed all the kids. We've got people in Green Bay making millions of dollars a year who are getting 3 meals a day at the public schools for their kids. Because it is socially unjust to only feed those who need to be fed. I mean, can you imagine Jesus when he's splitting the loaves and fishes, says, bring me one more basket, I want to feed all those Pharisees. But that's what we're doing. This is the misguided nature of all of this. Now, Arnie Duncan, oh, and by the way, 2015, 6 months before he resigned from the Obama administration, on the way out, here's what he said has to happen next if we're lucky.
The one idea I threw out that one sort of road tested with the kids too, I thought, is the idea of public boarding schools. And that's a little bit of a different idea or a controversial idea. The question is, do we have some children where there's not a mom, there's not a dad, there's not a grandma, there's just nobody home. And there's certain kids we should have 24/7.
So the assumption is that you can't feed your kids, so we're going to feed them all year long. The assumption is that we really have an epidemic in this country of 6- and 7-year-olds living in brownstones all alone. No grandma, no grandpa, no older sisters, nothing. Okay, we don't have that crisis, but let's pretend we do. Do you not have county agencies? Do you not have state agencies? Do you not have religious institutions who take care of these problems in your communities? No. What we need, maybe, is a federal boarding school plan where we can decide to take kids away from their communities and board. Oh, are we back in Prussia now? Do you see why I started with Prussia? See why I started with that? And even he has to admit, in 2015, it's kind of a controversial idea. Can you imagine? And by the way, the minute we start building, and if Hillary Clinton won the presidency, I think we'd be a lot closer to doing it. We started building federal facilities to take kids away from families. How soon, when you see what's going on in the public school now, how soon, if you're a believing Christian who believes marriage is between a man and a woman, how soon would that be cause to take kids away from you? What if you live in a particularly religious district of a school? Can't have that, right? At what point then, when you have a federal school system, a boarding school system, it's staggering when you think of all the things I've spent the first half hour showing you. He's talking about them. Every one of them he's talking about them. Bill Gates. Common Core officially entered your schools in 2012. And you were told when it was put in, this is higher standards than we had before. The governors wrote these standards. Teachers wrote these standards. These standards are the highest standards we've ever had in the country. Okay, fine, but how could you know that if you've never tested them? They didn't know it. And in fact, the guy who spent $8 billion of his own dollars putting it in your schools said the following.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
So in 2012, Bill Gates said, we'll know if Common Core works in 2022. Hey, Bill, can you imagine Bill Gates putting out Microsoft 14.0? And now, guys, I know if it's going to work, but you buy it, invest in it, load it up on your computer, but we'll see if it works for you in 10 years. Your kids are guinea pigs. This was not tested. It was not measured. It was not assessed. But then again, if you're beginning to see that this is not an education issue, Common Core was never about educating your kids better. Then you got this. Notice the date, 2009, right when Arne Duncan was rolling out his schools are the center of the community position. Bill Gates stood in front of a conference of state legislators and said this about your bailout money.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests. Next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
Oh, they told you that it's just a set of standards. Teachers are free to teach what they want. He told you in March of 2009, when we get those tests in place, the standards will line up to the curriculum lines up to the standards. Did you hear what he said? Not even 3 months into the new administration, already $350 million of the stimulus package was handed directly back to Arne Duncan to get this, to create the federal tests. Before they wrote the first syllable of the first Common Core standards, they had created the tests. And if you know anything at all about education, that is exactly backward. If you are creating tests and backfilling, you are indoctrinating kids. There's no other way to see it. And this talk that I give really annoys people. It should annoy you. Because every piece of information I'm showing you comes directly from their mouths. You don't have to listen to me. I'm just and it's all public information. You walk in to any Texas school tomorrow and ask them if there's Common Core in their schools, they'll say, no, we don't have Common Core. You walk into any Texas school tomorrow and talk to a superintendent principal. They will say, our teachers are free to teach any way they want to. You just told you that's not so. I'll show you it's not so coming up. But again, keep in mind that what we're doing is we're just looking at the Common Core issue through the mouths of the people who did it. And of all the people who did it, this is the one who's going to make you the maddest. That's David Coleman. Anybody know who he is? Some of you should. Most of you don't, right? Never elected to public office. Has no educational background whatsoever. Never took a course in education, never taught a class in his life. He's the guy who was in charge of the Common Core standards. He's the chief leader of the 5-man team who put it together. Wasn't done by the states. He was going to tell you it wasn't done by the states. Wasn't done by the states, wasn't done by teachers, unions, or governors. And you know why David Coleman was chosen to lead the Common Core standards? Because he served as Barack Obama's social media director in 2008 and successfully drove young people to the polls to vote for Obama. That's also the only reason he got the job. He is not accountable, he has no educational background, he's not accountable to you and me, the taxpayers, the ones who fund this public education scheme. He's not accountable. He's the guy who, more than anybody else, is responsible for what's happening now. In fact, don't take my word for it. Here's Arne Duncan in 2011 being introduced to a group of teachers who he now is the boss of.
He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential. He's never taught in an elementary school. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done.
You'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing something.
I actually think it's really important to try to base what I'm about to say to you on evidence I share with you rather than on the sands of my qualifications. So if I ask you or talk to you about doing something, it should be evident that it makes sense to you to do because I have no other authority.
I have no other authority, I have no other qualifications, I have no educational background. This is the guy who did it. He's going to admit in the moment he did it. In fact, the thing that's so shocking about this, I mentioned the word banana republic. A banana republic is a state, a nation, where all the elected laws, constitutions, values, all the legalisms are ignored by small groups or cabals or special interests who really control things behind the scene. Again, your education system was hijacked by a man you never heard of, with no experience. In fact, listen to him talk about his own organization. Remember John Gruber? John Gruber made $4 to $6 million advising the federal government on Obamacare, and he's not a doctor, he has no medical experience. By the way, Gruber was arrested last year. Did you notice that? For swindling the American government. This guy, listen to him and his organization.
So with that in mind, I'm about to jump in, but I'm just going to say one word about my own organization, which is Student Achievement Programs. Student Achievement Programs, all you need to know about us are a couple of things. One is we're composed of that collection of unqualified people who were involved in developing the common standards.
We are that collection of unqualified people who wrote your kids' standards. People ask me all the time, how can they be so brazen about it? Well, because the media will never report it, number one. Number two, name an area of modern culture where progressives aren't that arrogant. See, what the progressives have figured out is the tilt is on. Hollywood, media, entertainment, the big tech companies silencing conservative voices. Right? They've tilted things enough that they don't have to pretend anymore. Why are so many Democrats now running as Democrat socialists like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who couldn't read a map if you spotted her M&P? Why are we now seeing the radical left on college campus not even pretending to care about free speech or civil rights when they go about their protests? Because the things have tilted. But I want you to recognize one thing. They're telling you what they did to you. And as a 25-year teacher, the thing that aggravates me the most is the great lie of Common Core. That our teachers, who didn't ask for this, understand that too. Our teachers weren't consulted, they didn't ask for it. Nevertheless, our teachers have no freedom to teach anymore because everything is structured and top-down. Even if you've got teachers who know this doesn't work, and I've talked to thousands of them, I've got a stack of letters, 4,000 of them, sitting on my desk, 700 Common Core talks in 5 years, 48 states. 24 state legislatures I've talked to about this. 4,000 letters from teachers all around the country saying things to me like, you go, Dr. Pesta, but I don't dare show up to your talk in case my superintendent sees me. Here's the great lie of Common Core for me. That teachers they're just a set of standards, Dr. Pesta. You conservatives, you claim to be all standards, right? It's not a set of standards. It's a whole way of doing things from top up. This argument that you'll get from, you walk into a Common Core school tomorrow, they'll tell you, our teachers are free to teach whatever they need to teach. Listen to what David Coleman says about that.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving, there's no amount of saying, they teach the standards, not the test, we don't do that here, whatever.
Unelected, unaccountable, no education experience, but he just told you that there is no force strong enough on this planet to stop your teachers from teaching to his standards. Yeah, that's what he said. And I guess he was right, because Republicans, don't they control 38, 40 state legislatures? No, not a state's gotten rid of it. How many Republican governors do we have? How long have we had a Republican House and a Senate? And look, I'm not down on Republicans. I voted for Donald Trump. I'll vote for the Republicans again because they're not Democrats, personally. But when I talk to groups like this, it's a touchy thing, right? But something happens when our good people go to Washington. Paul Ryan was a budding young star, a policy wonk, a budget guy. What is he now? A swamp creature. And this is the problem, right? And I said it before, this is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It is a Washington Beltway versus the rest of us issue. And if you want an answer to the question of why we're doing this on both sides of the aisle, because whoever's in Washington, D.C. has a lot of power and authority. That's very, very hard to overcome. And if you're part of that Beltway insidership, it's the same issues again and again and again. Now that should really, really bother you. Here's the thing. Do you know what David Coleman is doing now? Now that Common Core is in all the schools. With all of his lack of education experience, he is now the president and the CEO of the College Boards, the organization that makes the exams your kids have to take to get into college. The ACTs, yeah. He's conforming the entrance exams to colleges to his Common Core standards. Did you know that? Didn't know that, did you? Shocking. All unaccountable. And by the way, the College Board is a private company who gets hundreds of millions of dollars a year from the government to write the tests. Just like Planned Parenthood. $500 million a year to do what they do. Shocking when you think about it. That's Jason Zimba. He is the architect. He's one of the 5 people that we are that small group of unqualified people who wrote the common standards. He's the guy responsible for the math standards. He at least is a professor of mathematics. So you got that going for you. However, in this interview, Jason Zimba is going to admit on camera that his Common Core math program will not prepare your kids for college math, and it will not prepare your kids for STEM careers. Well, let that sink in for a moment. Why would you create a math program that every kindergarten through high school kid in America is laboring under? We heard what she just said, right? Her husband is a PhD in mathematics, and he cannot sit down and help her little kids with their basic math program. Why? Because it's not a math program. Just like Common Core is not an educational program, it's a sociological one. Common Core math was never meant to make kids better at math. It was meant to confound talented math kids so that they lapse back to the rest of us. Think about what Common Core math asks kids to do. Instead of doing mathematics, they draw pictures, they write essays about math, right? They circles. If you're one of those kids, I never was. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a 2nd grade math level. I've never gotten much better than that. But my life is okay. I mean, that's why I entered, when I was in 3rd grade, I actually had a 12th grade reading level, so I was able to do that. That's why I entered the high finance world of college English professor, right? I could read, I couldn't do, and very often, people who are good at math aren't good at other things. If you treat kids like individuals rather than the collective, then you can help people become what they're God-givenly meant to be. But if you treat people like the collective, and see, here's the thing about Common Core math. If you're one of those kids capable of really excelling in math, one of those kids who's got it, and every time you sit down to do math, the teacher says, no, like she said, don't put them in columns and add them, draw a picture. Every time, like she said, right? Every time your kid sits down to do math, and he's got the multiplication tables memorized, teacher says, no. If you have it memorized, I won't give you credit for it. Draw 3 pictures, do 4 diagrams to show me how you get 8 times 8 is 64. Show me. 8 times 8 is 64, right? Show me. You understand what the premise here is? I stunk at math. So it doesn't matter if you got me drawing pictures or dividing things. It's not going to get me better at it. But it would be the equivalent, like me, with the 12th grade reading level in 3rd grade, being forced to sit next to my 3rd grade brothers and sisters reading Beezus and Ramona for all those grades, right? Pretty soon, whatever gift you have is ruined. But don't trust me. Listen to what he says. He's being interviewed here by Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Another story. I could spend 2 weeks doing this with all the information we now have. Sandy Stotsky is one of two experts in education that the Common Core hired to review their own curriculum. She is a retired professor of English reading standards from Arkansas, Sandy Stotsky, one of the most well-revered in the country. Common Core hired her to review the English curriculum. And they hired Dr. James Milgram, Stanford math professor, to review the math. Milgram is a guy who did mathematics for the space flight in 1969, helped to do that. So Common Core hired these 2 experts. They both looked at the curriculum and told Common Core to throw it out immediately. Sandy Stotsky said of the reading, it's going to set our kids 3 years behind the 2 years they're already behind readers in other countries. And James Milgram said about the Common Core math, this is not a math program. What did you give me? Why am I reading this? It is a sociological waste of time. And so what did the Common Core do? They simply fired Stotsky and Milgram and kind of blacked out their report and validated the standards anyway. So Sandy now is interviewing Jason Zimba. Here's what we got here.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition.
Yes, Dr. Stotsky. I think it's a fair critique that my math program is a minimal definition of college readiness.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM, it's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges.
It's not only, my math, this is the guy who wrote the math program. Not only is it not for STEM, I did not create this math program to make sure that kids will be able to use this math to become scientists, technology experts, engineers and mathematicians, all the things that don't matter. Not only is my math curriculum not for STEM? It's not for selective colleges. He's about to give you a little route. Well, for instance, he's going to say, if your kids want to go to UC Berkeley, they better have math beyond this. But here's the lie. Because a selective college in math is any college that has a basic math requirement. And guess what they all do? I won't stop at this time. It gets better at the end.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
Or some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM, it's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley, right?
Engineering colleges.
And that's true. I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that, but your issue is really broader than that.
Yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that
I'm not
out.
just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
So all he can do is shake his head yes. If you think I've edited this video, get my card, I'll send you the slides. He beclowns himself worse later on. One point he says, my math program might qualify some kids to begin math at a two-year technical college. Might. And did you hear what he just said to her? Just so we're clear on what this college readiness does and doesn't get you. If it's not preparing you for STEM careers, and it's not preparing you for selective math colleges, what exactly does it get you? And I mean, again, right from the horse's mouth here. He's not a stupid man. He's got a PhD and he's a college math professor. What he did was exactly what Common Core was meant to do. He turned math into something that kids good at math can do, into an exercise of making non-math people feel good about themselves. That's called social justice. How often do we see that what the left calls social justice is nothing more than making people feel good about things without having accomplished anything? And that's where it ties up with socialism. It's interesting that we understand why Antifa, who claims to be anti-fascist, is so radically aligned with socialism. And here's the thing. When we used to teach kids history, we don't anymore. When we used to teach kids history, we used to teach them that the Nazis were right-wingers and the socialists were left-wingers. Yeah, it's probably true that Stalin killed 3 times as many people as Hitler did, but Stalin was on our side, and socialism just didn't have the right timing, right? It's a great idea. Tell kids that. And I quickly point out, well, excuse me, the first 3 things the Nazis did when they took power, 3 out of the first 4 things they did. 1, gun control. No one had guns but the government. 2, what's the second thing they did? National socialized medicine. What's the third thing the Nazis did? They banned all schooling other than state-sponsored schooling. Matter of fact, there is only one law on the books in Germany today from the Nazi period. They got rid of all the rest of them, and it's a ban on homeschooling. If you homeschool your kids in Germany, you will go to federal prison. They'll take them from you, right? And so the argument, and let's remember too, so you want to pretend there's a big difference between socialists and Bolsheviks, and Nazis, I don't see it. And of course, not one of my university kids in the last 10 years, and I've asked every class I've taught, can tell me what Nazi stands for. Not one of them knows that it means National Socialist German Workers' Party. That's all. They don't know. Why would you teach that? Socialism is heroic. All right? The Nazis are those bad. As far as my university kids are concerned, Nazis were right-wing conservative Christians. That's what they think. But you've heard it from the mouth of Jason Zimba, right? Not a stupid man. The only person sitting on that Common Core committee who was actually academically qualified to even begin to do what he did. And he's telling you that I created a math program that is not for STEM careers and it's not for college. Because most kids aren't going into STEM careers, and still, only about 39% of American kids go to college. So the majority of American kids don't even go to college. So why create a math program that's only going to benefit college kids? It's not fair. Let's turn math into something that every third grader feels good about, and nothing more. I mentioned to you that David Coleman was in charge of the college boards. Guess what else the college boards does besides messing up the ACTs? The college board is responsible for all the AP courses your kids take in high school. So it's a great thing. Why pay $5,000 at UT Austin for a history course, which you know isn't going to be about history? Why pay $5,000 at UT Austin for a history course? When you can spend $100 as a junior or senior in high school and get a year-long history course, if you get a 3 out of 5 on the test at the end of the class, you opt out of your college American history requirement. Sounds like a great, millions of kids, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Texas kids are taking these courses. Guess what David Coleman did? He completely rewrote the tests, which meant that the teaching of history had to change to conform to the new tests. And are you surprised to learn that the very first test that David Coleman changed for the AP was American history? The AP U.S. History course, APUSH, from 2015. This was written by a left-wing college professor. By the way, I should tell you this. 300 primarily progressive history professors from universities all across the country, including in Texas, wrote a petition and sent it to David Coleman, begging him not to change the way history was being taught, because it would give American kids a false sense of their history. Coleman ignored the letter. Here's what happened. There is rising alarm over radical changes that have been made to the Advanced Placement American History program, a program heavily supported by federal and state funding. We're paying for that too. To summarize, the private college board is rewriting its AP courses, starting with AP U.S. History, APUSH. The new APUSH framework departs radically from the traditional AP course and now reflects progressive philosophy and leftist bias. Forget the founding fathers and the principles of the Declaration of Independence that proclaimed the natural right of freedom and self-government, and our kids are now in these courses focusing on the racist cultural imperialism that supposedly built America. The previous AP tests were all objective questions. Dates, places, names. Regardless if you were a radical liberal or a staunch conservative, there was nothing political about them. Texas had really good state history standards based on simple facts. Now, you know what the kind of questions the kids have to answer to be able to pass this test? In a 500-word essay, describe the racism that founded America from the 16th century all the way to today. In a 300-word essay, describe how American culture is misogynist. In a 500-word, these are actual questions from the last 2 years. In a 500-word essay, discuss the hostility of traditional Americans to immigrants of all kinds. And of course, this is what progressive history professors reacted against. It's only part of our history. 2, and you can see it up there, 2 objections that students would learn an inaccurate version of American history. David Coleman responded, and this is a quote: "Facts don't matter in history anyway." The entire paradigm of teaching AP history now is not based on facts. If it's not based on facts, what's it based on? You understand now that math without math isn't math? History without facts isn't history, it's ideology, isn't it? Do you understand now? Do you now get it? Why kids who can't, you've all seen these late night comedians go on to Harvard and Princeton and UT Austin and jam a microphone under some kid who's paying $60,000 a year and ask them tell us what the First Amendment does. And do it. They cannot do it. But these are the same kids now who are marching to rip statues down. I don't know anything about history. It's called a mob. We are incubating mobs. And by the way, what separates a mob from an educated group of people? Critical thinking. The very thing that John Dewey said we do not want our kids to learn in school. We're incubating mobs, right? And I told you, they spend almost no time on the colonial period. They don't talk about the Declaration of Independence. The kids do not read the Constitution in their American history course. And George Washington gets 1 paragraph. To give you an example, Barack Obama's inauguration just the inauguration had 64 pages in this textbook. Washington gets 1 paragraph. And listen to the description of George Washington from the textbook. And you tell me if this sounds familiar about what you know about Washington. Oh, and by the way, the preferred textbook, you can see the title of it, is Out of Many. Odd, isn't it? That's kind of half of one of our mottos. E pluribus unum, which means what? Out of many, one. Do you notice how the 1 is left off? Because we're not one people. We are not one America. We are thousands of different independent groups that must be adjudicated not by any collective legal standard or overriding sense of Americanism. In other words, the very way progressives and sadly many Republicans look at immigration is exactly what the title of that textbook is. We are not a nation. To the degree that we are in America, we're a bunch of racist slobs and homophobes anyway. We are a group of smaller nations within. Out of many is the title of the textbook. And here's what they teach your kids about George Washington. Although he dressed in plain American broadcloth at his inauguration and claimed to be content with a plain Republican title, Washington was counted among the nationalists. He was anything but a man of the people. By nature reserved and solemn, he chose to ride about town in a grand carriage drawn by 6 horses and escorted by uniformed liverymen. In the tradition of British royalty, he delivered his addresses personally to Congress and received from both houses an official reply. And that's it. No crossing the Delaware, no Thanksgiving Day parade, or Thanksgiving Day prayer, none of that stuff. And yet the irony of this is, my favorite Washington story, they're basically accusing George Washington of being no better than King George III. Equally terrorists, equally thugs, equally elitists. And yet they completely ignore the fact that the colonists actually did at one point offer Washington a crown. They offered him one, turned it down. My favorite Washington anecdote, when that happened across the sea, one of George's advisors entered where the king was and said, "Sire, we have report from the colonies," they still called them that, "we have report from the colonies that President Washington has refused a crown." To which crazy old George had enough good sense to respond, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in history." But no, just another nationalist, another warmonger. That's all they get. And then, guess what they did in 2016, the second year? They went after the European history standards, right? Here's what happened there. The new advanced placement European history framework has received a makeover. Listen to this, 2,000 years of Western culture. The new history framework eliminates religion's influence on the development of Western civilization. 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian values, the medieval Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation, all of it never mentioned. Your kids learn 2,000 years of Western culture without a single mention of Christianity or Judaism. History framework has received a makeover that eliminates religion's influence on the development of Western civ. It ignores altogether Winston Churchill. It whitewashes the evils of communism, and it praises the welfare state. According to Professor David Randall with the National Association of Scholars, quote, "The new curriculum omits the development of faith and freedom in European history and focuses on the development of the welfare state," Randall told the College Fix. The association released a report authored by Randall and his peers called The Disappearing Continent that claims this framework, quote, "warps and guts the history of Europe to make it serve today's progressive agenda." Okay, that's David Coleman. And people ask me all the time, if you've been paying any attention to what's going on in the public schools, you see all this weird sexuality stuff at young ages. They're pulling books out of kids' classrooms. We're teaching really graphic. We're using math even in some instances to introduce sexual concepts to kids. And people ask me why. How does that fit, Dr. Pesta, this collectivist paradigm? Well, you understand, right? That sexualizing children at young ages is a standard tool of all statist dictators. Because when you sexualize children at little ages, you are divorcing them from their families, you are divorcing from their innate sense of modesty, you are divorcing them from their religious traditions, you break them down sexually to build them up into something else. Did you know that in 2012, the very year the Common Core standards were put in your schools, this document appeared? These are the National Sexuality Education Standards. They are national, which means they're federal. They are standards, which means they will be tested in your kid's school. And they are, look at the subtitle, they are core content. What core was there in 2012? Common Core, right? And notice when they start teaching your kids sex, grades kindergarten through 12. And it's not just teaching your kids sex. The core content and sexual skills we're going to teach your kids. So we're not just going to teach your kids about birds and bees and sperm and egg. In other words, the biology of sex. We're going to teach kids attitudes, mores, and practical skills when it comes to engaging in sexuality, starting as young as 5-year-olds. By the way, this is online. Just type it in. You can read the whole 64-page document online. It is staggering what they plan to do. And if you look at what they plan to do, I'll show you a little bit of it, you will see exactly what's happening now in your kids' schools. Turn to page 4 when you get a chance, and you'll see this. When the national sexuality standards were being created, when they were creating a national set of standards for sex ed, they looked around at various things to build it. One of them, look at the last thing on that list. We cited the Common Core state standards for English and math. Give me a reason why a national sexuality curriculum built itself by following Common Core math and English. Because here's the answer. This is comprehensive sexual reform. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan introduced abstinence-only education, and the progressive left lost their mind. What they wanted as an antidote to teach them about biology and teach them abstinence. And by the way, that's the way it should be. Sexual skills and mores should be the parents' responsibility. What the federal government wanted was a comprehensive sexual plan that would teach a radical sexual curriculum to kids in spite of the parents, starting in kindergarten. And they wanted to fight, and so by the time you get to this, that's what you have. You think about this. In the 1970s, when sex education entered the curriculum, and a lot of people were wise to point out, it's not the biology that bothered us in the 1970s. It was what would happen if we turned over the teaching of sex to the schools. Inevitably, this would happen. So, it used to be that in the 70s, you would get what? You took a health class your sophomore year in high school. And for 3 weeks of that health class, one semester health class, you focused on reproduction. And before they taught reproduction to your kids, they'd send a note home to the parents saying, hey, we're teaching reproduction in the next 3 weeks. And if you wanted to opt your kid out of those 3 weeks of health class, you were entitled to do so. Now, how do you opt your kid out of math? How do you opt your kid out of English? This is foolproof, isn't it? They slip sexualized book. You have kindergartens learning about Jazz, the transgender person now. Teachers reading books to them. And again, whatever your issue is, America, whatever your issue is on homosexuality or transgenders, more power to you. However, teaching kids as young as 5 and 6 and 7, there's a reason. We never, ever, ever in our history taught 6-year-old sex, heterosexual sex. We never explained to 7 years old the mechanics of human sex. We didn't. Because kids that young are too little to understand it. They have abstract brains. They don't have abstract brains. They're literalists. Whatever you put in a 6-year-old head stays there. In other words, you are not teaching little kids about sex. You are indoctrinating them with this to soften them up down the road for what's coming. Again, I cannot think of a culture in human history, at least in Western culture, where we taught little kids any specifics about sex. Now we're doing it. And again, math and English, that's what we're going to deliver it through. Here is the NEA, back to the NEA, 2011, right about when the standards were being written, right about when the sexuality standards were being written, the NEA sent its spokeswoman over to the UN collectivism and said this about the coming new standards, quote, sex needs to be taught in education. The only way to combat heterosexism and gender conformity is comprehensive sex education. In other words, heterosexism, the fact that you believe men and women go together biologically, is now a clinical form of discrimination. And the only way we school teachers can fight heterosexism and gender conformity, the horrible idea that you people actually believe boys and girls are girls. The only way we can fight those scourges of evil is comprehensive sexual reform. The only way to combat heterosexism and gender conformity is comprehensive sex education. Gender identity expression and sexual orientation are a spectrum. And those opposed to homosexuality are stuck in a binary box that religion and family create. You're the reason. Your religion and your families are the reason there's bigotry. The only way to combat your religion, and your family is with comprehensive sex education taught to your kids against your will at low-level grades. 2011. That's the NEA at the United Nations. Here's of all the pages in this book I could show you, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides about how teachers are supposed to teach your kids about sex starting at age 5. Well, here's what we need. This comes right from the document. Well, instruction by qualified sexuality education teachers is essential for student achievement. In order to do this, a second grade math teacher has to have sex training. There are education programs in this country right now that are compelling young teachers, young math teachers, to take modules on how to teach sex through math before they can student teach. What is required for this is instruction by qualified sex ed teachers. How about this? In order to meet the standards, students need opportunities to engage in cooperative and active learning strategies. Group work about sex, right? Why don't this group go off into the coat room and do your sex homework together? Cooperative and active learning strategies. How about this? Sufficient time must be allocated for students to practice skills relating to sexuality education. And again, we don't teach biology in elementary school. We don't teach health in middle school. If you're going to do this, sex has to become an aspect of everything you do on a daily basis. And of course, it is becoming that. How about this? Students need multiple opportunities and a variety of assessment strategies to determine their achievement of the sexuality standards and performance. Comes right from the document. A couple months ago, end of the last school year, father in Madison, Wisconsin, had a middle school kid. He emailed me the following. Kid was a sixth grader, sixth grade. Here's his note to me, the dad. My son informed me that they are studying gay rights in U.S. history class. And this part of the class that expounded on the expansion of the meaning of the word gender. It was not presented in an open classroom discussion format. This is the way it is. So this kid's a sixth grader. And as we found out later, 3 full weeks of the American history course was devoted to arguing in favor of homosexuality in a variety of ways. And here's one of the things they did. They were handed multiple, you can't see it, I'll explain it. They were handed multiple sheets of paper that had 96 different gender options on it. 96. These kids, and I can verify this. Your kids go to college, here's what's going to happen. They are going to be taught that male and female are social constructs. This is biology. The only thing we have that verifies any gender is biology, and we've got male and female. But they're going to be told that male and female are simply social constructs that don't exist. Meanwhile, 96 different genders, made-up genders, are to be treated as if they are absolutely factually true. Remember the kid at the University of Indiana in Pennsylvania 6 months ago? Remember that? He had a biology kid, sophomore in biology at college. And he was in a biology class. And his teacher was going on about this. His biology teacher was telling him that male and female do not exist. He held up the book and said, but ma'am, it says right here it does. And none of the other stuff is in this book. She insulted him, threw him out of class, reported him to the university, who was this close to expelling him, until national organizations found out and sent a team of lawyers to defend that kid and get him back in the classroom, in biology class. And again, whatever your position on the issue is, it's fine. But man and woman do not exist now. But everything in between does. And I'm just going to share with you some of the categories. How about ego-gender? Gender so personal, it's described as you. How about gender blank? All that comes to mind when you think of gender is a blank space. How about gyrogender? Being multiple genders but not understanding any of them. That's a logical tautology. How can you be many of anything by choice but not understand it? Anyway, how about mirror gender? Your gender changes to fit the people around you. So now we've got gender chameleons, right? You're in a room full of boys, you're a boy. But boys don't exist. A room for a group, you see the problems with this, right? How about paragender? Identifying with a gender, but not as a gender. Quoigender, gender is felt as inapplicable to you. Surgender, you're 100% one gender, but with more added. Now that's Common Core math. See, I may not know how to do a lot of math, but that's Common Core math. You are 100% one gender, and then a little more too. How about vapogender? Gender like smoke, shallow but disappears.
What's he been smoking?
How about virangender? Gender that disappears as soon as you identify it. I mentioned to you before that the entire premise of Common Core is to create tests that mean nothing, and then compel every school, every teacher to be limited only to what leads to that test. And those tests are highly, from what kids have told us, by the way, kids are told when they take the tests, they're forced to sign a piece of paper, even little kids, saying they will not reveal the questions on the test to anybody, including their parents. But what we have garnered from what we've been able to see, these questions are I'll show you in a moment. They're idiotic, they don't make any sense, and they're highly, highly politicized. You know who agreed with me that these tests were utterly meaningless? That guy, right before he became president. In 2007, here's Barack Obama sounding a lot like me, and I don't got any kind of teleprompter. Here's Barack Obama sounding a lot like me right before we elected him.
Don't tell us that the only way to teach a child is to spend too much of a year preparing him to fill out a few bubbles in a standardized test. We know that's not true.
Don't tell me the only way to educate a child is to have him spend too much time filling out a bunch of bubbles on a standardized test. And look at the idiots who are cheering for him. The NEA. They're cheering him because he wants to get rid of standardized testing. And 1 year later, the entire education system of America was subordinated to standardized tests. 1 year later. And when he subordinated our kids' education to meaningless tests, the NEA cheered him then too. How bad are these tests when left-wing social commentators from foreign countries can mock it? You know, we've got this weird thing in this country. People like Samantha Bee and John Oliver, we're important, Trevor Noah, we're important all these people of the world to come here and tell us how much we utterly suck, while they're making millions and millions of dollars telling us we suck. There's something really wrong with that. Here, how bad must these tests be, however, when radical left-winger like John Oliver mocks them? Here's what he said about them.
If standardized tests are bad for teachers and bad for kids, who exactly are they good for? Well, it turns out they're operated by companies like all these, and let's just focus on the largest one, Pearson. As of 2012, they had nearly 40% of the testing market, almost triple their nearest competitor. And if you've never heard of them, then congratulations. But just mention their name to any parent or teacher in a state they operate in, and you see what happens. A hypothetical girl could take Pearson tests from kindergarten through at least 8th grade, by tests, by the way, that she studied for using Pearson curriculum and textbooks taught to her by teachers who are certified by their own Pearson test. If at some point she was tested for a learning disability like ADHD, that's also a Pearson test. And if she eventually got sick of Pearson and dropped out, well, she'd have to take the GED, which is now, guess what, also a Pearson test. Their track record is littered with complaints concerning technical glitches, slow grading, and even the contents of their tests. Take what happened in New York just a few years ago.
Almost 30 different test questions have now been declared invalid because they're confusing or have outright errors. They'd already pulled 6 questions from an English exam related to a bizarre passage about a talking pineapple. Students had to answer questions about the story, which they say goes like this. A pineapple challenges a hare to a race. Other animals figure the fruit has a trick up its sleeve, but the hare wins and the animals eat the pineapple. It ends with the moral. Pineapples don't have sleeves.
I was really confused because I expected a lot more from them. That article about pineapple hair is stupid and absurd.
So, you'll have to stop from crying. But remember, you hear what the announcer said? According to the kids, this is what the question read. We still haven't been able to see the tests. But I'll tell you, those are the kinds of questions they ask. The question is nonsensical. The purpose of these questions is not to measure what they know. It's to see how fast they quit. You're using question, the question has no answer, doesn't make any sense, right? It's designed to see when your kids quit taking the test, when they start to break down. There is no possible way these questions have any value. And yet this is what they're doing to our kids. This is developmentally inappropriate. The kind of testing we're doing to these kids. The inability to see the test, for parents to see the test. The inability to teachers who could maybe help kids on the test if they saw it, don't even have that option. How bad is it? And we're done. We're just about done. One more thing and we're done. So if teachers didn't write the tests, teachers don't get to see the tests, and teachers can't then grade the tests, who does? Will it surprise you to learn that they're taking out ads on Craigslist, $9 an hour, for people off the street to come in and grade your kids' tests? How about that?
The company posted this ad to Craigslist. It's to find people to grade the exams.
We looked at an essay every 2 minutes, a short answer every 5 seconds, every 10 seconds. We don't understand your kids. We don't understand anyone's kids.
I was told when I was beginning a project that last year, there were a certain amount of 2s, a certain amount of 3s, a certain amount of 4s. We expect that to be similar this year. If that's not similar, they will tell you, we're scoring too many 3s, we're scoring too many 4s. And they'll say, you have to learn to see more papers as a 3, you have to learn to see more papers as a 4.
So non-teachers with no educational background getting paid $9 an hour off the street come in and sit down and grade these exams that mean everything. It's the only thing that matters. And as the first guy told you, we had to read short essays in 2 minutes. We had 5 seconds to read short answers. I've been teaching college for 25 years. I can't read a short essay in 2 minutes. I can't. With all my training, I can't do it. Unqualified people, you got 5 seconds. And then the second group of people told you, right? And even when we graded them, even when we did what we thought was best, they came in and told us not to do it. You got to do it this way. You're not giving us enough of what we... In other words, the scores and the breakdowns were predetermined. They decided what they wanted, and then they hired people who didn't know any better and who were easily manipulatable to adjust accordingly after they graded them. So what are you going to do? All I will say is this. Education works when it's least complicated. The American people became a superpower, really did, on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. Think about the one-room schoolhouse. We're too big now for that, I know, but think about it. You had one teacher who was hired by the local people, the people whose kids she were teaching. So if she wasn't doing a good job, you'd get rid of her, right? You'd bring a chicken and she'd educate your kid or something. But in that one-room schoolhouse, you had 3rd grader, 7th grader, 11th grader, 9th grader. Why did it work? Because the teacher knew those kids, and she taught and treated them like individuals. In the 1960s and 70s, what happened to our schools? Real local control of the schools got bumped up to school districts. And what happened in the 70s and 80s? The states took over, right? It went from district control to state control. And then what happened in the 90s and the 2000s with Goals 2000 and No Child Left Behind? And then the feds took over. Now we are as far away from what works. What works in education is a committed student. A kid who says, yes, ma'am, no, sir. A kid who reads what he's given to read. Or a kid who does the math problem she's assigned. A disciplined kid. And a teacher who cares. And the third thing you need is a parent who will pay attention and hold their kids accountable. You got that? Education problem solved. Do you understand now, with federal control of education, you cannot get farther away from that model until all this goes over to the UN. You saw the NEA spokesman over there kissing up. Bill Gates has said definitively, we need Common Core, one world curriculum in every school in the world at the same time. Every kid in every school worldwide should learn the same thing every day. And they're all calling for getting rid of teachers, make it electronic. One computer, one voice, in all the languages, teaching the same things. Now, if I started by telling you that, you'd look at me like I was a tinfoil hat wearer. Have we done enough? You want to sit here another 2 hours, do you? You think about everything we did here today, and I'll send you all my slides, which is 4 times this much information. All for you for free. Fact check me. Go ahead. 700 talks. No one's ever one time written to me and said, you know, you're wrong about this. Take it. You don't trust me. Take it all. Look for yourself. But when you do that, I hope you will come to the one obvious conclusion. If nothing else you take away from tonight, is this, that education in this country, in the government sector, isn't really about education, or not at any meaningfully high level. I'm going to let Steve come on up and say goodbye. He has a couple things to say to you. It's been a late night. Don't feel like you have to stay, but let Steve make his final presentation real quick. I will stay and answer any questions you have after that if you'd like. So go ahead, Steve.
Can you hear me? There we go. Yeah, so right now, Dr. Pesta does this basically to try to break even. And we promised him we would try to get him reimbursed for his travel expenses and everything. So we're going to pass the hat around and strong arm you for as much money as we can get out of you, and get his plane tickets paid for and his hotel paid for, and some food.
I can live without the food. I just don't want
to. He hasn't missed a meal.
Yeah, that's not a problem.
So how many educators are out here? Do we have any teachers, educators, administrators? So you all understand everything that he's talking about. We are expecting schools to do more and more for our kids. Just in Richardson, just to let you know, they've got 4 schools that they're doing from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we don't have the funds for those schools.
Just do the AMA.
So we'll open it up to question and answers while y'all are digging.
They never even saw them.
Purse for
27,000
cash.
pages, they never even saw them.
I know, but the exams that were done in the woodworks.
Yeah, I have a
The
question.
AMA,
I have
they
no
don't
idea.
have a
I have
petition.
no idea.
I'm a retirement.
I have no
You
idea.
have a question?
I'm sorry. Yep.
The U.S. history book that you showed that clip from George Washington, do you know if that was a textbook that's been approved by the state of Texas?
I do not know that. There are 3 or 4 textbooks available, and they're more or less the same. I don't know what you guys are using. I don't know. I know I got the teacher's manual of that textbook cannot be bought unless teachers sign a waiver not to reveal what's in it. I was in Florida. I know Florida uses it. About 2 years ago, a teacher came up to me and had the book under a trench coat and said, "This is the teacher's manual. You've got 10 minutes to make copies." And so that's where I got it from. So even if you buy the student book, you're not going to quite get the full effect of what teachers are told to teach kids. But I do not know if Texas is using that one. I will say this, Texas is so big, I'll bet you that there are different, depending on where you are in the state, different books are being used.
Do you know who the publisher was on it?
Oh, gosh.
It wasn't listed, I think.
I can tell you. Get a card and email me that question. As soon as I get back to Wisconsin, I'll let you know.
And one thing I'd like to say to this group, this is why we need to give the State Board of Education authority over quality of content. Because what's happening now is the books only have to have, like if the students should be familiar with George Washington and his role in U.S. history. That paragraph that you saw right there would suffice. But it doesn't go into the more important things that George Washington did. And that's why we have got to get back to letting the State Board have not quantity approval, but quality approval.
My question to you would be, why do we necessarily trust our state boards of education more than a federal one? You know what I'd like to see personally? I'd like to see textbook selections. If local school districts are allowed to choose their curriculum, let local school districts choose the books and have teams of moms and teachers pick the books.
And we do that in Texas.
Good.
The State Board approves 6 or 7,
Good.
and then districts get to pick their individual one.
Good.
But again, a book that had that information on George Washington would not have slipped through the cracks if the State Board had had more authority over content.
I guess, who elects your state board of education? How do they get it?
The people in this room.
So you do vote them in?
Yes.
Okay. If it's representative, I'm okay with that. Yes?
Can you put forward an estimate, a guess? Why is it you have so many rich people like John Rockefeller and Bill Gates who are basically pushing socialism?
I would simply posit this, that the more money, this is my answer about the Hollywood people too. Why are Hollywood people who are making millions of dollars doing something kind of stupid, reciting somebody else's lines, why are they so leftist? My personal, and this is utterly unscientific, I think the richer you are, the more successful you are, the more you feel guilty about it. And the way you make yourself seem like a common person when you're making $60 million a film is to be real hyper-political, right? You care about the man, right? You care about the downtrodden. Now, George Clooney just put a big fence around his house in California, right? As he lectures you that you should live in communities without fences, right? But I think what it is, it's a psychological mechanism. Now, that's for low level, not the 1%ers. I think for the low-level celebrities, it's a way of showing your bona fides, right? That you're still Jenny from the block. For the mega millionaires, I think what they recognize is a true thing. In all socialist-type statist countries, there's a very small group of hyper-wealthy, privileged people who oversee everybody else. And they see themselves as that. And by restricting that to others, it solidifies their role as the overseers. I'll tell you this, the George Bush kids would never have to study under Common Core. The Barack Obama kids would never have to study under Common Core, never. Our kids, they tell it. Well, go back to one last thing. You recognize, right, that if Obamacare was so wonderful, why did the House, the Senate, and the President exempt themselves from it? If the Democrats at the time who controlled the Senate and the House, or the Senate and the presidency, if Obamacare was really wonderful, what I would have done, I'd have said, here's what we're going to do, American people. We're going to show you how great our health care is. Just we Democrats in Congress are going to take it for the next year. We're going to give up our Cadillac plans, and once we do that, you'll follow us. No, what they did is they forced it on you, and they kept their Cadillac plans. That's the President, the Senate, and the Congress. That tells you what the hypocrisy is. Ma'am in the back, go ahead.
STAR testing in the state of Texas, even if you gave the state board all of the authority they wanted over the best textbooks, the garbage would still be taught in the school because the kids have to pass the test.
That's the other issue. It's a great point. Why do you have so many crappy textbooks in your kids' classrooms? Because you have to bring textbooks in to make kids prepared for tests that you have no control over. If you had a state board of education that not only got to determine the books, but created the tests for Texas kids, now that's where you're getting better, right? And that's why what is so insidious about this is it doesn't matter, now it doesn't matter what you do, Texas. That window is closed. Because even if you all wake up tomorrow and realize that this is a scam, the tests are meaningless, you can't remove the tests. One of the things, and I don't know if you're aware of this, one of the things that the ESSA Act did in 2015, when the Republicans rammed it through, was to require every state in the union to get their educational program approved by the Federal Department of Education. Did you know that? Now, because of that, you have, if Texas says we want to change, we want to use our own textbooks, we want to ignore your tests, if the Federal Department of Education says no, you're out of luck, and you get no federal funding. That's where we are now. This whole thing now has been elevated to the level of the federal. What used to, 5 years ago, you could have affected real change at the state level. Now you got to dial 1-800 Department of Education. How long do you think you're going to be on hold before they pick up the phone? Yes, yes, sir.
Didn't Ted Cruz say if he had been elected president, one of the first things he would have done is gotten rid of the Department of Education?
Ted Cruz has, but here's the problem, and I don't doubt it, maybe. I vote, Ted Cruz won. The last thing he did before he faded in presidential campaign was he won the Wisconsin primary. I endorsed him. I'm probably not supposed to endorse people, but I endorsed him because he certainly was better at education than Hillary was, and he promised that. But here's the problem. Every serious Republican candidate for president since 1980 has said the same thing. Ronald Reagan, his huge landslide victory in 1980, people don't remember this, was fueled in part by the absolute horror of the American people of the Department of Education. We're used to it now. In 1979, Democrats hated it too. So he got elected, never did it. George Bush, H.W. Bush said, elect me, didn't do it. George W. didn't do it. Donald Trump, and I'll be a little bit generous with Donald Trump. Why in the world would we expect Donald Trump to know the first thing about public schools? His entire life, right, has been spent in all his kids, all his brothers and sisters, all had elite, swanky private school education. Why would he even know? I guarantee you what happened in the campaign is a bunch of his advisors says, hey, Americans hate Common Core, be against it. And he did. But here's the thing, he also promised, I'll go to you next, he also promised that he was going to get rid of the Department of Education. And do you know who we appointed to the Department of Education, right? A career public school woman who sat on Jeb Bush's Common Core Implementation Committee. That's who we put in. Now, I'm telling you, is Betsy DeVos infinitely better than Arnie Duncan? Yeah. Here's my post-mortem on this. Under Donald Trump, education will not get any worse. But that's like telling a stage 4 cancer patient, right? Not going to do anything. You'll be the same all the time. But here's the problem. If you're not going to fix things, if you're not going to pull out the problem, the next Democrat in office, the whole mechanism is there just to take it further. And that's where we find ourselves. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, under what basis is the constitutionality of the Department of Education based on?
Up until 2015 and the legislation passed by Republicans, wasn't. So what did the ESSA Act do? It legalized that. Are you willing to give me 5 more minutes of your time? I'm going to show you the ESSA stuff. It's just right coming up. Because you got to see it to believe it. What the ESSA ultimately did is there's Article 10 of the Constitution, right? Amendment 10. Things that do not belong to the feds, the narrow few things go to the states. Education, if you're going to have any kind of a cohesive education plan, it's got to be state-led. And up until really 1979, when we created the Department of Education, that was the rule of the land. Then in 2015, as I mentioned to you, through the ESSA Act, retroactively, Republicans passed a bill that ceded control of education away from the states. Is it constitutional? I would say no. Did it get passed? Yes. Is anybody paying any attention? No. All right? Here is, let me see if I can get this. All right. Here we go. 2016, notice when they passed it. 4 days before Christmas, 2015, on a Friday, on a playoff wild card day, when no Americans were paying the least bit of attention. Despite warnings from anti-Common Core activists, Republican lawmakers rammed through the new federal education bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, setting in concrete the destructive education policies of the Obama administration, including Common Core. We now have proof that Republican leadership, including Senator Lamar Alexander, Representative John Klein, House Speaker Paul Ryan, betrayed their constituents, giving the federal government unprecedented control over education. Ryan allowed Congress just 2 days, day and a half, to study the ESSA legislation, more than 1,000 pages that had been written over a 10-year period. Arnie Duncan, Barack Obama's Secretary of Education, called the passage of the ESSA Act by Republicans a miracle. In a just-released interview with Political Pro, Arnie Duncan expressed stunned surprise about how wonderful ESSA turned out for progressive educrats. Quote, "I'm stunned at how much better it ended up than either the House or Senate bill going into conference. I had a Democrat congressman say to me that it's a miracle. He's never, ever seen anything like it. If you look at the substance of what is there in the ESSA, embedded in the law are now the values that progressives have promoted and proposed forever. The core of our agenda from day one. It's all in there. For the first time in our nation's history, it is the letter of the law." Gets even, right? That's what happened. It's a miracle. Arnie Duncan. Got to know it. So, no, it's not constitutional. It's not constitutional, but it's the law. I don't know how that works. If we were a functioning republic, those two statements couldn't be made simultaneously. Yes?
So apart from homeschooling your children,
Can you speak a little louder?
apart from homeschooling your children, which is highly recommended, what do you do about this? We have some lawmakers in the room here, and hopefully, after this video, that a lot of us will forward a copy of this to our lawmakers. But what do we do? We could take it on the lawmakers in the state of Texas to, take back our education system, but.
I guess what I would tell you is follow skeptically, with one eye open all the time, whatever political process in the state you think is going to help. You can make it better. You can ease some of the pain. Like that sexuality stuff. You ought to be able, Texas, to drive that out of your schools. Should be easy. if you rally. You can do that. It's not getting done, but you could do it. But you're not going to fix the real problem, right? The real problem is getting education back in the control of Texans, number one. And then the minute you did that, I would urge you to then break it up from the states. Because it's the states who got you, and your own state got you into this mess. Well, your state did, and you didn't take the money. But 46 states sold out their own constituents for $600 or $700 million, one time. And it's not like you're going to get New York's not getting $700 million every year. A one-time shot, $700 million of your own stimulus money, right? They hand it out to New York. And for that, New York kids are suffering under Common Core in perpetuity. So by all means, pursue politics. If you're going to elect Republicans, try to elect ones that you think will be the same Republican you elected when they're in Washington. When your Republicans go to Washington, try to hold their feet on the fire. You can do all of those things. But again, what can the U.S. Senate do about this? Nothing. Congress would have to repeal it, right? So one thing you can do is push for the removal of ESSA. But I'll bet you more than half of your Republican lawmakers in this state would tell you ESSA was a great thing. You watch, because it was passed by Republicans. It's got an R by it. So 60% of your Republicans, the other 40 won't know what it is. Let me put it that way. 40% won't know what it is, and 60%, because Republicans did it, will say it's wonderful. You get rid of this, you get meaningful change. You get rid of the ESSA Act, you get rid of the Department of Education, and then at some point, you take away the power of states to regulate. Here's another big thing we could do right now to help fix education. Stop letting your universities accredit our teachers. What in the world makes you think some professor is going to make a good teacher out of a kid? You know, think about not to try to be over, I already stepped into that pool. Not trying to be purposely offensive, but here's the thing. Education as a discipline is problematic. When education professors want to train somebody in English, send them to English professors. When education professors your kid wants to be a high school math teacher, they send the kid off to the math department to learn math. Education itself has no real discipline in it. It doesn't teach a subject. The education side of an education major's education is nothing more than abstract multicultural theory. It's pure rhetoric, and it's highly politicized. You don't need 2 or 3 years in an education department to learn how to be a teacher. You could do 1 semester's worth of classes in the discipline you're getting your degree. Get rid of education departments. They are utterly useless. Kid wants to be a high school math teacher, let him take all the high school math, the math courses he can, and then 1 semester before a student teaches, you have math professors who are teachers themselves, give them some basics of classroom management, right? You did that? How hype? These kids are graduating from our education programs, weak in their subject areas, but really, really, really high on all kinds of social justice garbage that they've been fed. If you want to affect classrooms, you could do that. And I'll ask another question. I'm a teacher. I am very sympathetic to teachers. I'm the one who said to you, don't blame the teachers for Common Core and ask for it. Having said that, if 1 million American teachers, easily there are that many who hate this, maybe 1 million or 2 that love it, but there's 1 million who hate it. If 1 million American school teachers collectively stood up and defied their union and said, you know what? This is a travesty of education. Our teaching ability has been compromised, and your kids are suffering. If 1 million, can you imagine if 100,000 American school teachers banded together and said no more? There'd be a change. But where are they? Can anybody imitate a cricket? I gotta laugh, or you're gonna go home crying. Yes, sir.
I just want to make sure that we all understood you, because I think this probably needed to sink in. I think you just suggested that something would be good to do would be to get rid of the college departments of education.
I don't think they serve any meaningful purpose, and there's nothing they do that can't be done by qualified professors who are already teaching them subject matter.
I agree wholeheartedly. I'm shocked to hear anybody actually say something logical and,
And let me also say this. As somebody who teaches teachers, in the state of Wisconsin, we still have a requirement that every high school kid has to read some Shakespeare. So as a professor of Shakespeare, I get all the education majors who want to be English teachers. And I'm being very sincere here. They are the worst students I have. The 1 or 2 of them that are doing it because it's their vocation are as good as any other student I've ever had. The vast majority of my education majors, they're education majors because they failed out of everything else. Education is the one area in a college campus you cannot fail out of. It is the sink through which kids who try to do everything else end up in. And again, for those of you who are good teachers and it is your vocation, again, my best education majors, the fraction of them that I get every semester are among my best students, but the vast majority of them have no business getting anywhere near your kids. None. But you can't fail out of that program. You cannot fail out of that program because that program is predicated on your social justice bona fides. How do you get student teachers? How do student teachers then impress their other peers? It's not about how much math you know. I don't care about that. You're not even teaching math anymore at a serious level. It's about are you down with the causes, right? Are you alerting kids, right, to bullying? Are you championing a sexual champion for your middle school kids? Sexual rights? Are you advocating for all sorts of progressive socialisms on your progressive social causes in your classes? Like everything else that's monolithic. Progressives have dominated education since 1850. And last thing I'll say to answer that question, and if there's no other, I don't know if there's any other questions, but we'll get one or two more in. The last thing I'll say about this issue, though, is if we allow, you ask, how do you fix this? If we allow progressives to have a monopoly on our teachers, our classrooms, our colleges, and our campuses, if we who hold the purse strings, your state legislatures, controlled by Republicans, in Wisconsin, I said this to you before, we got arguably the most conservative governor in the country. We've got a Republican House, a Republican Assembly, and a Republican Supreme Court. Everybody, when it's time to elect Republicans, they gripe about how education at the University of Wisconsin is politicizing kids. It's shutting down conservative voices. It's making a hostile environment for non-liberal kids. And then when it comes time to send the budget, everything the schools ask for, we give them. After all that griping, $600 million goes right from the budget to the schools, the universities. We can't even find Republican legislators to defund the colleges. You know what the endowment at the University of Texas is? Do you know how much money the University of Texas has in account? Harvard's endowment is $60 billion. But they don't have to spend a penny of it because of all the government money we're handing them. They're sitting on $60 million. I guarantee you the endowment at UT is probably close to $10 billion. It sits there and collects interest. Double that. Meanwhile, you're paying for diversity officers. You're paying to hire more multicultural classes. You're paying for more identity studies teachers on these campuses with your taxpayer dollars, and your Republican Senate and Congress, your Assembly, they want, because you don't want to get on the bad side of it. You're a politician. You don't want to be on the bad side of the teachers' unions. You're a politician. You don't want the pointy heads at the college campuses, right, saying, and here's the irony. With all the money Republicans keep handing to universities, does it make the universities love the Republicans more? No, the more you give them, the more they hate you. But this is politics in America today. Yes, ma'am.
Thanks so much for taking your time to share all this with us.
Sure.
I'm in the trenches, educating my kids. I'm a homeschool mom.
Good.
I have a senior.
Yeah,
I'm
good.
also the director of a local homeschool club. So what I've heard you say is that, we run core classes for our high school students because we all have tough credits. I'm in charge of that transcript, and I'm saying, yes, you have a valid chemistry credit or whatever. I was educated in private school, and I had to take the SAT and the ACT, and there are people here who have their kids in public school. Bottom line of what I heard you say is that there is no meaning anymore. There's no validity to the test if we're...
To the big standardized test, that's right.
Right, but my kid had to take, he's doing dual credit, he had to take the TSI. So I'm sitting here thinking, how do I even know if we're doing anything appropriate or correct if I don't exactly know how the TSI test is built, and then eventually when my kids take the SAT and the ACT, what's the real benchmark?
Well, I would say as a homeschool mom, your benchmark is easy. This is really simple, too, on one level. As a homeschool, my homeschool, Freedom Project is a homeschool academy. What we do is, the goal is if you want your kid by the time he gets to be a senior in high school to have some calculus, then that's easy. Then you know what you need to slot 2 years before. You know what you need to slot in middle school, right? How do you get your kids there? If you want your kids to be able to read as seniors in high school the great books of Western culture, Whether they like them or not is another issue. If you want your kids, by the time they're seniors, to be able to open a Shakespeare play and make reasonable sense of it, if you want them to be able to sit down with Dante's Divine Comedy and get the general meaning of it, if you want them to be able to sit down with the Federalist Papers and begin to make sense of the arguments back and forth, if that's what you want, then you got to start kids reading higher and faster and higher sooner. Now, your second question is the big question. What am I doing if after giving my kids a real education, they have to take national tests like the ACT that won't reflect it? That's the question, and here's the answer. Number one, last year alone, 152 colleges rejected the ACTs and the SATs. Your university's professors are highly radically political, but they're not stupid. They know those tests don't mean anything, number one. And number two, nobody knows this. This drives me crazy. You do realize, right, that every university in this country has their own testing services. Every university in this country has to have tests. They can give transfer kids. They can give homeschool kids so they can begin to figure out where they belong. You call, your kid wants to go to college, forget about those stupid standardized tests. Call the University of Texas, call A&M and say, call Baylor and say, you know what? I want to bring my kid to your school on a Saturday afternoon and I want him to take your math and reading tests. They'll sign you, they won't charge you for it. They won't even charge you $100 like the ACT does. You'll go, they'll give you the test. If you go and take the University of Texas, Texas is not going to have Common Core tests. They're political, but they don't want to teach. College professors of math don't want to teach 7th grade math. College English professors don't want to teach Dick and Jane to sophomores. So those are real tests. I'm promising you now, if your kids show up at those schools and ace those tests, and if you give them a real education, they will, they're getting into those schools. Bypass the system. Now, does that one thing now, if you take the ACT or the SAT, there are certain national scholarships you might qualify for. Live without that, right? But again, test schools, by definition, schools are places that test people. Let them test your kids. They're the ones who have to teach them. Yes, ma'am.
Trying to figure out what Texas could do, and we do have to realize, of course, we've got progressives and Republican parties in the state level and national, and that's a big part of our problem. But could Texas just refuse the federal education money and then do more with it?
Yes, you could.
Then that's maybe what we should be asking our legislators.
That's like asking a pig not to be a pig, but if you can make that work. How long has it been since our politicians were interested in that? But I don't mean to be coy, but you're right. One thing you can do, by the way, is if you reject all federal education funding, then the Federal Department of Education can't do much. The only thing they have is your funding. And here's the other thing, and this is true of every state in the union. The amount of money the federal government gives the states is between 6 and 9%. No state in this union gets more than 9% of its overall education budget from the feds. That's nothing. And I'll bet you with Texas it's probably 7 or 8%. You could make that up easily if you wanted to. You could, but you won't, but you could, right? If you could push that platform, right? If you could raise funds, you could do this. I mean, you could do this. The 5 major cities in this state could lobby that money. You could do it. But what your college professors are going to say is you hate education, right? What your teachers' unions are going to say is you're depriving our kids of money. And here's the question that I can't seem to understand. We all know, Democrats know, that our schools, our public schools, are failing our kids. And yet the only answer we ever hear from even Republican politicians, more money, of course, more money. And with the more money we spend, there's almost an inverse performance. I mean, if we can't collectively, as Republicans and Democrats who love our kids, if we can't collectively recognize that that's a losing proposition, how are you going to get them to cut loose federal money, with free federal money? How are you going to get them to cut that? This is the problem. And maybe is there any other critical question? Then we'll have one more and that'll be it. But here's what I'll say. The real problem lies with us. It's us. They didn't do this to us. They didn't do any of this to us. We let them. We gave them our kids. We asked for nothing. We put up with no achievement. We put up with the fact that our kids were being sexualized and bullied and being exposed to drugs. We put up with the fact that our kids are being shot in schools across the country. We put up with it. Keep sending them back. Keep sending them back. And then we get mad that they're reading junk books or they're doing fake math. The problem is, and the statists knew it, that you would come to depend on the state schools as government, as babysitting, as daycare. All the moms I've talked to, the moms who have said to me, we can't afford to homeschool, I don't buy that. All the moms who've said that to me, because when they come up to me, tell me they can't afford homeschooling, their kids have leather tennis shoes and iPads, and they got video game boards, right? And they got really nice clothes, and they take 3-week vacations every summer, and they're all doing swimming lessons and ballet and soccer. You can afford all that, but you can't afford to teach a kid math, right? Okay, fair enough. But all these moms have come up to me and said, I can't do it. It's not even that, doesn't even bother me. It's the fact that they say to me, well, I just need a break from my kids. I mean, I can't be home with them all the time. If that's your attitude, then you deserve what you get, right? I say this all the time. From the moment your kids are conceived, in the womb, you're teaching them things. You're singing to them, you're speaking to them, you're exposing them to language and music, before you even see their pretty little faces. Remember, before you were conceived, before you were knit together in your mother's womb, I knew you, the Lord said, right? You were teaching them. Everything we do, every act of love with a kid, every act of discipline with a kid is a teaching moment. And yet, when it comes to the rudimentary knowledge that will allow them to take care of their kids, we punt, right? To people with cheap 4-year education degrees that are low on subject content and high on ideology. And the reason for most of the moms I've talked to, I got to do my Pilates classes. I need to work a few hours a week. I got to get away, right? Okay, just keep it in mind. At some point, we're entitled, I think this is the point. American moms and dads get exactly the education they deserve. And you've heard that statement, right? The American people are still strong enough that we get what we choose. And we're choosing. And let this horrible statistic stay with you. A couple of years ago, Gallup did a poll. And one of the questions they asked American moms and dads, a big sample, do you believe American schools are failing somewhat or a lot? 82% of Americans surveyed said that public schools were broken. 82%. And then they were asked, how do you feel about your local school? 87% thought they were wonderful. So almost 9 out of 10 Americans think the schools are broken. But less than 25% think their school's bad. Denial. Thank you very much. Come up and get a card. I'll send you the slides. And glad you were here tonight. Hey, thanks for being here.
Heard about the movie October Skies. You would enjoy that.
I've seen it. Thank you. What's your name?
Willie.
Willie, nice to meet you. Hey.